All right, Josh, we're back at it. We have a guest this week. Maybe you could introduce him for us.
Yeah, so we have a good friend of ours, Bruce, here. And Bruce, the reason we are excited to have him, we've known him for quite a while now, several years. He is not just also a political junkie, he's a research and facts-based junkie. And
Our kind of junkie.
Yeah, and he likes going deep in thought into a topic instead of just jumping to the surface-based arguments. So we are excited to have you here, Bruce. And there's a specific topic that that both of us, I'm very excited to discuss. If you want to kind of bring that topic in, what are we going over today?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Josh and Jon, for having me in your podcast.
Absolutely.
It's really a great honor to be able to stay here and just talk about this stuff and be able to go through some of these topics and, see what we come up with. So thank you very much.
You bet.
So what topic are we addressing?
We're going to talk about how identity politics has come to dominate the political discourse in America and how that's affected how people see themselves, Republicans, Democrats, and how that influenced the 2016 election, how that led up to the 2026 election, and maybe discuss a little bit about how that's affected the political discussion in general coming into 2020.
Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and kick it off then.
You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy and Jon Walsh.
And special guest, Bruce.
Now, there's an endless amount of information on any given topic, and sometimes you just need somebody to extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting.
So, Bruce, we hear a lot about new racial identity politics. It comes up in the media quite often. Seems like a lot of stuff is broken down into racial lines, or demographic lines. So how has this racial identity politics shaped the narrative since 2008, since Barack Obama took office?
Well, part of the reason why I want to discuss this topic is because I'm reading a book written by Michael Tesler et al. About identity politics, and one of the central points of the book, one of the conclusions he draws, is that after the 2008 election of Barack Obama, the politics became more racialized for people, as basically he was saying that the racial attitudes became more closely aligned with parties because of who Barack Obama was. And then afterwards, you start to see more division and more sort of identity-based politics, and that essentially Trump walks into that and sort of utilizes it to his own advantage.
Yeah, and you uploaded a video for our research, Bruce, that I liked, and I encourage everyone to take a listen to. It's the author is being interviewed by Chris Hayes, and he kind of goes into what I found was very interesting research they've done about how before the 2008 election, they would do studies where there was no significant correlation between racial opinion, identity politics opinion, and political party. So there's the notion that, one party very socially liberal, one party not, which might be true now, or more true, let's say. But this book, some of the research, I've been listening to the book, full disclosure, I unfortunately haven't gotten all the way through listening to the audiobook, but I find it really interesting how it does take, I think, a more objective look at how race and politics has evolved now compared to a lot of other analyses, which usually are definitely defending one side, vilifying another.
So one of the things that he pointed out that I wanted to kind of illuminate in his lecture was something that he called a uniform swing versus a distinct swing. And for many decades within the political spectrum, we have seen this swing between, he targets two groups. He targets high-educated whites and non-educated whites. And they kind of vote and I shouldn't say non-educated, but high school or less, they kind of vote systematically the same and have done so for decades. But in 2016, we saw what is called a distinct swing, where those two divisions became increasingly apparent. So, for example, they found that college-educated whites versus non-whites, basically the college-educated swung to the left and the high school or less swung to the right in 2016, whereas they were typically together on that. And he started to target specific areas in which they swung to the right, of which immigration and tolerance for Islam was one of the biggest key indicators of that swing. So I'm wondering, maybe both of you can address it. How do we see evidence of that swing? Where is it driving the policies or just the rhetoric? Or what effect is this having on American politics in general? And Bruce, I'll start with you. If you can kind of touch on what you feel is kind of the motivating force behind this, and what is where do you see the outcome of this coming, other than just in presidential elections?
Well, one of the things to note about identity politics is identity is not just one column. You can slice identity politics in a bunch of different ways. And for the Trump MAGA movement, there is a drive to sort of consolidate a bunch of identities into one sort of unifying identity, which is the idea of a legitimate real American. And then they consolidate the real American identity into a series of other identities. And it's you can be any number of those things or all of them. And so you sort of gain political legitimacy by being either one or more of these things. And so that's how you find that you have different groups slicing off. So you might see that, and this is the role that like social status comes into play, because what this identity politics basically does is says, based on who you are granted the most, the highest legitimacy or status in society. Your voice matters the most and should matter the most. You should be the ones that your opinions and your beliefs or whatever should be expressed as the true nature of our society. And so you gain a status in that way. But if you slice it along other lines and you are comfortable as a highly educated person and you don't feel like you need either racial or religious identity to gain status in society, and you have it because you're, have a career and money and you live in a nice neighborhood, then you don't really feel like you need that as much as others.
And Josh, why do you think it is divided on a right-left spectrum in such a way that we saw it diverge in 2016?
Yeah, I think, and one argument that I'll be uploading is a brief video from the YouTube channel Big Think, where they have a lot of thinkers from both the right and the left. And one significant argument that really stood out to me was that we have all these identities, and the idea that this is actually nothing new, like including intersectional identities. But what is new is the degradation of a national identity. So for decades, we had people who were like, yes, I'm a gay American, I'm an Asian American, I'm a Jewish American, but they always had there was always that emphasis on the American umbrella. And that has kind of degraded partly because the right, the far right. Sorry, I should clarify. You can be very right wing without being an extremist right wing, right? So, people on the very extreme associate. They kind of hijacked the nationalism and national identity and said, you aren't American if you're not this. And Democrats kind of let them do it. They didn't. They said, if you have national identity, then you're a part of the extreme right, instead of saying, no, you don't get to hijack it. Like, we are all Americans. So anyway, we have seen that become polarized. And as a result, now we have less of that umbrella that keeps a society, intact and, you're allowed to be a gay American, Black American, Jewish American. You can be a transgender, Black, gay, Muslim American. That's fine, but we're all under this American umbrella. And I think there are other reasons why we have become polarized. I think there are economic reasons, reasons that aren't really aren't discussed as reasons tied to this, but do play a factor. But again, one argument that really stood out to me that was that we've lost this national identity because, to me, it seems like, well, that's one thing. It's just one thing we can do that would significantly, bring back the unity we have. Like, let's start working towards that. Hey, yes, you're different. Yes, you're the same. Yes, you're this, you're that. That's fine. But we have this American identity. I think that could maybe, it won't solve everything. It's not going to eliminate racism or sexism or whatever, but it will restore us back to that place of, all right, we might be really different, but we're all in this together. Let's figure it out.
I think there is a certain amount of sort of intrinsic backlash that people feel about being identified as a thing and then sort of being put in that box to say, well, if you're this thing, if you have this identity, then you must do these things. And I think there's always an appeal, and this was Obama's appeal, of putting, sort of national unity or Americans at this sort of center point of, what you should be doing. So your identity as American should guide your sort of policy decisions, what's good for the country, not necessarily what's good for me as a, identity. So there's a lot of backlash people have about being put in boxes, and I understand that. But the other problem is, of course, is that identity politics has always kind of been there, and that's what things like dog whistle politics has been about, is that there's always sort of been these cultural majorities, and those cultural majorities have always took it for granted that their views always would represent that unified view of what America is. And some of the identity politics that we're seeing now is a backlash to trying to broaden what it means to be an American and whose interests get to be represented. So there's the social justice progressive movement has been trying for years and years and years to expand this idea of who gets to represent America. So in the past, it's sort of like America was represented by this sort of majority viewpoints. And then we decided that at some point in time, we say, well, we should stop just having it be representative of majority viewpoints because there's lots of people who feel excluded from the conversation because they're not allowed to express their views because they don't represent a majority race, they don't represent a majority opinion on sexuality, they don't represent a majority opinion on religion. So they've sort of been excluded. And now we need to bring those people into the conversation. And the more people we can bring in, the bigger tent, the more sort of ideas of where we should go represents a better view of the population as a whole, as opposed to a slice of it and saying these are the only people who, really get to represent the culture as a whole.
The difference between the right and the left on this topic is the right is kind of functioning in a way as to identify who they don't feel should be within the country or the party itself, whereas the left is using identity to say who should be included. Is that wrong? Is that an inaccurate way to look at it? Are the Democrats or the political left just trying to open the tent as far as possible to kind of scoop up the remains that the Republicans are leaving behind? Or is it just kind of exclusively being utilized on the political right?
So what you find is this is one of the sort of points of disagreement about what is actually happening. So from the left point of view, what you're trying to do is you're sort of expanding the tent. You're trying to bring more people in who were previously excluded so that they could now express their opinions. And yes, sometimes those opinions are based on their tribal or identity. So that means, look, I've been excluded from certain things, or I'm being biased or prejudiced against because of certain features of who I am, I need to bring that to the national discussion, and we need to talk about that. But from the right, they see that as trying to promote these interests above other people. It's not just bringing these people into the conversation and letting them speak and letting them be heard and considering those points of view and maybe even making policy changes to address some of the problems that different communities and different people are having. The right definitely sees this as they want to bring these groups in and replace what we consider to be the true sort of viewpoint of, the sort of big tent Americans with these minority views that they want to have represented above all these other things. So if you listen to people who are critical of the DNC convention for Hillary, they looked at it and basically said, the Democrats just want a party that the only people who get to speak are everybody but, white men, cis, what we consider to be the sort of normal people, the things, all the groups that were considered to be sort of like the basic, normal, default positions. They're basically saying the Democrats want to exclude those people and not just include more people. They want to start excluding other people.
Yeah, and I think there has been a shift too. Like an example, what I half jokingly say to other Democrats is, there's this perception that Obama was popular and elected because he had that inclusive strategy. Like I would say half jokingly, 10 years ago, if we had safe spaces emerge on college campuses, the safe space message would be, hey, this is a safe space, meaning whoever you are, like white, black, Hispanic, whatever, hardcore Republican or hardcore liberal, we want you in this safe space. You are welcome here as long as you don't, treat someone like trash because of an immutable characteristic. Like if a transgender person disagrees with you, you can have an intellectual debate, but you can't be discriminatory. And unfortunately, what it quickly became was if you're different based on an immutable characteristic, I don't want you here. It seems like it has become, by identifying people more intersectionally, has lended itself to that, as well as only stoked the racist, the extreme right, only stoked their fear that, oh, we're being left behind, we don't matter. Do you agree with that, Bruce? Do you see it? Do you agree with it? Do you think I'm totally imagining stuff?
No, I don't think you're totally imagining it. But what I will push back against is I don't think the reality of this, like the left being super discriminatory against sort of certain types of groups of people, is as prevalent as it is presented. So what you find is this has been a very successful talking point among right-wingers, among right-wing talk. Their whole shtick is outrage and victimization. And so they have discovered that you can go out there and you can find on college campuses and various other places, people will say things like, well, if you're a, white, cis, hetero person, then we don't want to hear from you. But then what they don't talk about is all the other people who are saying, well, we just want to hear all voices equally. So what you find is there's even, maybe you can look it up because I can't remember what it is right now. There's even an organization among the right wing that basically monitors college newspapers and college campuses. And as soon as something like this comes up, as soon as somebody says something, and realistically, we're talking about people, who are not politicians or media people. They're just speaking their minds. And, not everybody, speaks for the majority of, people on the left or the Democrats. They speak what they believe is the truth. And what the right likes to do is find people who are saying these things, whether or not they represent a large majority of people or not, and present it as such, basically saying they'll find somebody who's very sort of hard line, speaking their mind, and then basically elevate them to sort of representative of the majority viewpoint. And they'll say, oh, well, look what's happening on college campuses, by basically taking a microscope, finding the one example of this and blowing it up and saying, see, this is what's happening. We found this person who said this outrageous thing.
It's a straw man argument.
Well, and this pervades right wing. Essentially, what they do is they comb through all the stuff that's going on, social media, Facebook, television, and they find the one example that illustrates what they think is the big narrative, and they blow it up to represent everybody. So you find a person who's at a protest screaming and yelling, white people should just go away and shut up. And they say, well, see, there's the left. That person represents the whole entire viewpoint of the left, the Democrats, everybody. And then they kick it with a chaser. They hate you and they want you to go away.
So it seems that the debate on the political right is largely fueled by the immigration debate. I want to know, how did it get so important, to be the number one issue on the political right? And then B, what is the hope and the objective on both sides of the immigration debate? The right will frequently accuse the left of only doing that to widen their own base, not because it's the policy of the right thing to do, to have an immigration system that works and so forth and so on. It's more about, you just want the votes. So is there any truth to that ideal on the political left, and why is it such an explosively triggering ideal on the political right? So I'll start with you, Josh. Why do you feel that identity politics has shaped the immigration debate?
I think, and this might be a somewhat controversial view, is I believe that a lot of it is straight up racism. There is obviously a percentage of people who just hate someone who's darker because they're darker, of course. And I think a lot of it, though, is where the perceived prioritization is. So kind of like what I mentioned earlier about how, people feel like, the Democrats will fight to the death for someone who's coming here illegally. But when I'm literally burying there's death in my family and I'm burying my own child, they literally couldn't give a damn. And there's also an element of the fairness doctrine that both parties have. Like, for instance, on the left, more than the right in terms of like financial reform and stuff, there is a loud fairness doctrine mantra of, if you're wealthy, you got to play by the same rules. It's not fair that a working class or middle class American has to play by different rules. You have socialism at the top and it's capitalism for the rest of us. And I think for people who are more considered to be anti-immigration, let's be clear, there is a delineation between people who are anti-legal immigration and people who are anti-immigration. And I don't know.
But it does get conflated a lot.
It does. And I also don't know, and I'm not going to make assumptions on the percentages. I could be wrong if I said 1% of people who are anti-immigration or of legal immigration are racist. It could be a much higher percent or whatever. But I think it also plays into their version of a fairness doctrine, which is, I'm playing by the rules every day. I'm playing by the rules. I'm working hard. I'm doing what was pitched to me as the American dream. Yeah, someone wants the American dream, but they come here illegally. They, quote unquote, skip the line and they get the preferential treatment. It's that fairness doctrine, like, wait a second, that rich dude skips the line. He gets the preferential treatment. That's not fair. Same thing on the right of like, wait a second, it's not fair. So I believe.
Think that the reason it's so triggering is due to the fact that they're being cheated through the process?
Well, I think both parties have.
Or there's a feeling of it, rather.
There is a feeling, and I think both parties have failed miserably on this, maybe because of how they've portrayed the other party or how they want to be portrayed themselves. Like, for instance, I believe the vast majority of Democrats and Democrats running for office believe this, yet they don't get up and say, I understand and completely empathize with, and to an extent agree with, the concern and the notion that we don't want to have completely open borders. There are things like drug smuggling that happens, and there are some issues that we do need to address. And I want to sit down with you if you have that concern. I want to sit down with you and figure it out, because whether you're on the left or right on this issue, we can do better. Like, they don't say, hey, if you're against illegal immigration, I respect that, and we can do better, though, than letting people die trying to cross the border. Let's come up with an actual solution. They don't portray it in a way that's like, hey, I respect how you feel. Let's figure it out. Same with Republicans. They'll say, Obama was 100% not like open border guy.
Right,
yet,
yeah.
They portrayed him as like, well, he's elected, so welcome Sharia law, here we go.
Welcome amnesty.
Yeah, amnesty, and they portray each other like this. I think both parties have failed, but I also feel like the Republican Party stokes the fairness doctrine fear. Like, there are people, it's such a, I don't want to offend anyone, I think it is such a non-issue compared to other things. The handful of people who come here illegally, they're not stealing my job as like a senior programmer. They barely speak English. They're not, they're at a disadvantage. So I don't think I think it's being conflated as a big issue. And it is playing into that fairness doctrine. And that's why, like, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren do connect with a lot of right-wing voters, because they do feel like they're getting screwed. And if you don't talk to them about the ways they are getting screwed, like rich people playing by their own rules, then they're going to look around and someone like Trump's going to come along and say, yeah, you're getting screwed because of those brown people. And they're going to go, you know what? Like, maybe.
So, Bruce, why do you feel it's such a triggering or motivating factor that triggers people? Do you agree with Josh's assessment? And is it really split on party lines as the way I outlined originally?
So one of the most interesting things that I heard was apparently the Trump campaign had his staffers go and listen to a bunch of right-wing talk radio to see what people were talking about. And essentially they came back and said, hey, everybody's talking about immigration. And so the question becomes, why was everybody talking about immigration? Why was immigration the thing that people wanted to talk about on these talk shows?
Right.
Because on these talk shows, they're very much, in a feedback system with their listeners. They throw something out there, and if it gets outrage and it gets, engagement, because we do live in an engagement economy, apparently, where, your bread and butter is just getting people to pay attention. And if, sparking outrage among your listeners is a great way to get people to tune back in the next week, then that's where you go. And so, in a way, you had an audience that was receptive to anti-immigration messages. And the right-wing talk show host, tuned into that and went with it and spun entire narratives and ideas and crafted this anti-immigration sentiment into their sort of right-wing worldview.
Do you think they were playing the market?
Yeah, I mean, there's essentially an argument that says that, right-wing talk really, there was an interesting article, I think I gave you a link to it, and it was about the rise of right-wing talk, and they were basically saying Rush Limbaugh started out as just a shock jock type of guy who would just go on the radio and try to...
I've always seen him as the Howard Stern of politics. Just take the most outlandish point of view, and that will generate ratings.
Right. So what you find is it's almost like these machine learning algorithms where, like, what gets hits and what doesn't get hit, you move in the direction that you whatever breeds success, you keep going in that direction. And as long as you keep getting success in one direction, you keep going that way. And, somebody like Rush Limbaugh on the right wing tuned into feelings of resentment about immigration. Also interesting to note is if you look at the immigration numbers, what you find is that the number of immigrants in the country really hasn't changed because the inflow and the outflow has been sort of balancing each other out. So the perception of the country being overrun by immigrants is really just a perception. What you have is you have both sides looking at the same problem, which is inequality, and one of the running themes since sort of the sort of implementation of sort of neoliberal policies back in the 80s, Reagan, Thatcher kind of stuff, is that it sort of paved the way for this current episode of mass inequality that we have, where certain people are just racking up the points, and everybody else is just sort of like, well, I'm having a hard time scraping enough together to pay my bills. And so what the left and the right have to do is they're offering competing interpretations of what is going on. I support the left interpretation because I believe it's more grounded in facts, which is basically this idea that, policies and decisions made, 50 years ago or so, 40 years ago, basically made it easier for people to accumulate mass amounts of wealth, tax cuts and deregulations and, trade policies that have, allowed people to, outsource and to pit labor against each other. And so what you have is an interpretation on the right that basically says, well, because we believe that capitalism always produces the correct outcomes, since one of the core tenets of the right is that capitalism is good, then you have to interpret this story in terms of like, well, we can't blame capitalism. We can't blame the system because we know it works. We've accepted that as a matter of sort of principle. So what is going on? And the interpretation that's always offered is, well, somebody must be sticking their hand on the scales. Somebody must be, messing with this somehow. And their interpretation is always like, oh, well, it's the Democrats. What they're doing is they're trying to upset the order. They're, trying to, rearrange the economy in a way that favors people who don't deserve it versus people who do. And it's always framed in terms of like, you, dear listener, are the one that deserves to have a fair share in this economy. And they're over there trying to give people a leg up and trying to get them free stuff. And you're the ones who are suffering from it.
So I've always found that as sort of a self-defeating way to sustain a political movement. When you look at where the political right is at and where they're kind of setting their meter at, it's very exclusionary. It's you hear it on the right a lot, what a true conservative is. I've seen that after every conservative president has left office, the right regroups because that person usually leaves in dispopularity, and they regroup and they say, well, he wasn't a true conservative, right? Well, I think that is what plays into their identity politics is we need to outline what is a true conservative, what is a true American, what makes America great, and we need to hold people to those standards. So as a long-term effect within politics, pushing people out of the group is not a sustainable way, especially if the group that you identify with is shrinking in numbers. I always kind of look at the political right currently as a meteor that's entered our atmosphere. At its core is Trump and his base of supporters, but you have things flaking off and breaking off the whole. And what we really don't know is how large the impact is going to be when it hits the earth.
It was inevitable that it would get to this point of race and identity, especially because if you talk to conservative and liberal voters on issues like economics and stuff, they're actually less divided than they used to be. Like, For instance, conservative voters now also believe that we shouldn't be in so many wars overseas. They also blame big banks for the financial crisis and want them to pay some kind of price. Like, there are so many issues that we do agree on, yet when you're running for president or office, you can't paint yourself as similar to the other side. You can't even paint yourself as sympathetic to the other side, otherwise you will lose your base. So I think it's come to a point where it's like, the only remaining super divisive thing is, or the only remaining issue that you can weaponize is race and identity. And so that's why it's being stoked more than ever, is because how do you weaponize an issue that Americans agree with against your opponent?
Thanks for listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And make sure you check out our website for other episodes, itmightbeinteresting.com. And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com.